Hey everybody, and welcome to another installation of SANDCRAFT DIY. Today we're going to be putting a steering rack stabilizer on this 2026 Polaris Xpedition. This also applies to the Ranger HD 1500 as well. First step to the installation is raise and support the front end of the vehicle so we can remove the front tires. You don't have to lift all four because we don't have to rotate the driveline. Now that we have the wheels off, our next step is to crack the jam nut loose on the outer tie rod end and then separate the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. So now we're going to use a flat blade screwdriver to split the pinch clamp on the inner end of the CV boot and then move the pinch clamp on the outer end of the CV boot to expose the inner tie rod end. Now we're going to remove the inner tie rod end from the steering rack. Those of you using a tie rod tool, it is a 32 millimeter. My favorite weapon is the pipe wrench. Now we're going to repeat these steps for the tie rod on the driver's side. Once the tie rods are removed, now we're going to go ahead and remove the 4 mounting bolts for the steering rack. We do not need to disconnect any electrical or sector shaft joints at all. The rack will stay in place, just the 4 mounting. On the passenger side lower of the Xpedition is a modified weld nut that has a chassis tang to hold it in place. So here we have the unboxed Xpedition steering rack support assembly, new tie rods. The kit also comes with bellow boots to seal the rack. So now that we have our steering rack stabilizer unboxed and parts accounted for, there's a little bit of disassembly before we go and install onto the vehicle. So on both Xpedition and Ranger steering rack stabilizer installations, you will have to install the passenger side upper bolt into the mounting bracket before sliding the bracket to the steering rack body. Once the passenger upper is in position in the steering rack and possibly started on the Rangers, the other 3 bolts can be installed by shuffling the stabilizer body bar back and forth. Sometimes it can be a dance, if you will, getting all 4 bolts installed and aligned. So now I'm going to shove the crossbar over to the passenger side to open up room for my tools, and then I will snug the driver's side hardware. I'm going to be installing on the Xpedition the weld nut bar with the tang towards the bottom. So now that the driver's side hardware is snugged up, we can move over to the passenger side. On the Ranger, this upper bolt is going to have to be wrenched in because of the weld nut on the backing plate. On the Xpedition, it's just 2 nut and bolt with the tang facing down. So the reason the steering rack stabilizer is important is that it's actually a rack stabilizer and not damper. So it is deceiving that out here you can see it's a 1-inch shaft, but after you cut in the serrations for the actual rack and pinion mechanism to work, it drops down to just under 3/4 of an inch. That being said, you get enough feedback from the outbound wheel, it'll force in on the rack and it can fold anywhere through this partition depending on where the steering angle is and bind your steering in place. So now we're going to install the bellows boot first with the large opening inbound on the steering rack itself. Now we're going to start to install our ear by taking our gold inner joint bolt. We're going to apply some red thread locker and we're going to run it through the middle of the outer ear right into the bellows. We're going to leave the center bolt about a 1/4 turn loose, and that's just so we can pivot and align our crossover bar. Now I'm going to push the crossover bar to meet the ear on the passenger side so I can align the ear. I'm going to install the 1/2-inch bolt into the crossover bar, and then now we can torque down our center bolt. Now we can torque our crossover bar bolt. Now we're going to take our SANDCRAFT provided inner tie rod end, install it into the ear, and pin it with a through bolt. And we can tighten the clevis bolt now. When you tighten the clevis bolt down here, you definitely want to make sure you have it all the way bottomed out. Very important, guys, that this tie rod does do a full swing of motion through the whole entire ear. So it's very important that you go back and you reset your jam adjustment to where you cannot get a mechanical bind. You're gonna run it all the way down to where you're close, but not touching. And that will allow you enough steering adjustment for alignment. So the reason we cracked the jam nut upon disassembly is we are going to reuse this outer end and jam nut transferred onto the new inner tie rod end. Now we're going to put the outer tie rod end nut on the bottom. Now it is time to seal our bellows to the rack and the outer ear. It's got to be pulled all the way over the outer ear lip and retained around the steering rack collar. Now it's okay to go ahead and start with the safety wire. Really limited on space. There wasn't many options for clamps, and we found this is the best route to go. Now we're going to go ahead and switch back over to the driver's side and repeat all steps. You can cycle the steering and grease the steering rack, add some lube for the future service life because it will be in there for a while. Once you've done all your final torque values, you want to go ahead and cycle the steering, make sure there isn't any binding. You might notice a slight resistance, but that is just a brand new crossbar polishing into the new bushings. That will smooth out with a few miles. So with your tie rods compressed all the way in, that is going to give you a little bit of toe out, but that's enough to mount the wheels and trailer it to your local alignment shop, which we strongly advise you do, because you'll be amazed at how well the car drives afterwards. You can do your own alignment, entirely your own prerogative. Just make sure you double check your jam nuts. All right, now that the cycle is complete, we know we're good in the hood. That completes our installation. Thank you everybody for watching and enjoy the ride.